Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. We are so excited to share the power of healing from complex trauma with all of you. It's inspiring to know that so many of you tune in to learn about the personal and collective healing that can come from resolving complex trauma. We are thrilled to offer the Inner Circle, NARM's online learning community. Each month, members receive direct mentorship from NARM creator Dr. Lawrence Heller, NARM training director Brad Kammer, and other NARM faculty through live webinars. These webinars deconstruct the various elements of complex trauma, including issues related to developmental, relational, cultural, and intergenerational trauma. They will also guide you through a step-by-step process of learning how to integrate NARM into your work by sharing NARM demonstration videos of client sessions and then pulling up the hood to describe how NARM is being used with real clients to resolve complex trauma. The NARM Inner Circle is a great place to start your exploration of NARM. Whether you're a mental health or other helping professional, educator, or just interested in addressing complex trauma, there's a place for you within the Inner Circle community. You, our Transforming Trauma listeners, can receive $100 off your annual membership when using the code TransformingTrauma15 at checkout. Visit narmtraining.com/innercircle to sign up and for more information. Today's guest is Prashant Goel. Prashant works in service of healthy cultures and systems. He specializes in leadership development, drawing on both scientific research and global wisdom traditions to advance renewed practices of attention, execution, collaboration, and innovation. Having studied and practiced with world-renowned teachers, Prashant brings over a decade of experience in transformational approaches to leadership development, as well as systems and culture change. Intensely curious about societal progress, Prashant holds 3 advanced degrees, a Juris Doctorate, a Master's in Business Administration, and a Master's in Economics for Transition. He has also been formally initiated in 3 wisdom lineages from the Amazon, Himalayas, and West Africa. Prashant blends these unique experiences to inform the work he is doing, and we are happy to share this conversation with you today. Please enjoy. All right, we are here with Prashant Goel, and welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Thank you, Emily. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. How are you today?
I'm doing well. I'm actually in South Africa right now, so I'm a number of hours ahead of you. And I've been kind of looking forward to this conversation all day. Yeah.
Great. So before we get into learning more about you and your work, we like to ask on this podcast, what is it that you hope listeners will get out of listening to our conversation today?
I would hope that this conversation in some way supports them to feel connected to themselves and to their own work, and maybe in some small way inspires or illuminates something for them about their own work. Yeah.
Beautiful. So, like I was saying before we pressed record, one of my favorite parts of doing this podcast is getting to know more about our guests and your background and the work that you're doing. So where would you like to start?
We could start with what brought me to NARM and what I appreciate about NARM, I guess. There's kind of the shorter term answer to what brought me to NARM, and then there's the longer term answer of what brought me to NARM. And I can begin with the shorter term. The shorter term was that I was having challenges in my own relationship life, and I was getting curious about trauma. I had done, as I'm sure as the conversation unfolds, we'll get into some of my background, but I had done a number of different types of explorations in a deep way. And I was curious specifically about the trauma angle. And so I reached out to a friend who's done a ton of investigation in the area of trauma, and she specifically mentioned NARM. And I picked up Healing Developmental Trauma. And I was in a moment where I wasn't reading a lot of books cover to cover, but I did read that book cover to cover. And I was really impressed, and I became very intrigued. And I even had the chance to work with Aileen in person and receive some hands-on work with her, which was amazing. But it was only at the beginning of this year that I came into NARM Basics Training. And I continue to be really impressed. And I'm looking forward to going into level 2 next year, actually.
Great. So tell us more about the work that you're doing in the field of complex trauma.
Sure. So I work with individuals, I work with teams and organizations, and I also work with groups. And I'd been working with individuals for a long time before I specifically went into trauma-informed approaches, but I realize now that I'd kind of always been working with trauma, and that interest really stems from my own inner work. And I'll tell a little bit of my personal story just to, support the audience to get acquainted with some of where I'm coming from. But essentially, to share the deeper story, my upbringing, I had 8 adverse childhood experiences out of the normal 10 in my story growing up. But I also was kind of on an achiever path because it was the one thing that my survival strategy is allowed for, was in an achiever mode and was performing well, was getting good grades. I did get attention in those spaces. And so, fast forward to my 30s, and I'm a strategy consultant in New York, but I'm feeling a sense of values misalignment. And I don't even really have language for any of it. I feel unfulfilled. I'm partying really hard and I'm performing at a high level, but something is definitely unfulfilled and I don't really know how to understand that. And so my lifestyle starts changing. There was a moment where I was in Argentina and I was drinking a ton of red wine and eating a ton of red meat. And I would be like, I'm not drinking tomorrow night. And I would go out and get, really drunk that night and I'd feel terrible. And then when I came back to New York, I was like, okay, I'm going to start something inside me. I started meditating. I started practicing yoga. And there was a time where I was flying back from San Francisco and I'd been partying really hard with my friends. And I finished reading Gandhi's autobiography somewhere over the middle of America on a flight back to New York. And I'm like, I'm never drinking again. And that was like 12 and a half years ago. And I still have never had a drop. And Gandhi's autobiography opened something up in me. It was like, whoa, there's way different ways you could be living your life. I had never had any exposure to something outside just a conventional professional life. And so I decided to take a sabbatical and I left for a year. And so many things opened up during the course of that year that I ended up actually having a decade-long self-directed inquiry into various forms of healing, spirituality, self-knowledge, shamanism, depth psychology, different forms of body work, plant medicine, all sorts of things, shadow work, a lot of workshops, a lot of meditation. And so transforming those ACEs that I experienced internally, having a chance to go through that process, which remains ongoing, of course, but a lot of transformation really informs. And I also think about the guy that I was when I was 30 before I got exposed to any of this. And I see it now and I'm thinking to myself, well, there's a lot of people who are like me that are in conventional contexts that never had any exposure to any of this stuff. And it's the most powerful stuff I've ever learned. It feels like it puts me in touch with the meaning of life, And so that's a lot of what motivates me. And I work with it in various ways. And it's like, even when I'm working in teams and organizations, I'm very interested in how I see it almost as though they're fractal expressions with additional layer of complexity to what individuals experience. It's like, how are teams disconnected from each other? Where is cohesion lacking in a team? Where are fundamental principles that drive health somehow not being aligned with? And getting curious about that and supporting teams to track that in themselves, supporting systems to see themselves, to sense themselves, such that when they get in touch with themselves in the same way that an individual does who's practicing with a NARM practitioner, for example, that contact with self generates the impulse for change.
The first thing that landed for me was just how you said you didn't even have language for what you were experiencing. That here you were having 8 of the 10 ACEs and highly functional and achieving, and you still didn't have the language for what that was missing. Wow. So you started working with teams, and I love that this thread that you're pulling in of like working with teams and systems. There's a correlation to how we work with individuals, and that connection to self that you named is so important. So you're definitely in the field of complex trauma. I'm curious. Oh gosh, I want to jump ahead and like hear all the things. But maybe first, can you tell us how you define complex trauma? How do you relate to that?
I feel the answer to that itself could be complex. There's dynamics of our symptoms. There's dynamics of the causes of those symptoms. There's sociological phenomena that play out, cultural phenomena that play out, family systems dynamics. And there's so many different angles we can take on complex trauma. I think the simplest way I would put it is that which causes disconnection.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, you kind of were already telling us this, but what really led you to work with the complex trauma? I'm hearing it was a lot of your own process, but then I'm curious because you said you took a sabbatical, and I can't remember what you said, the work that you were doing prior.
Yeah.
But then what brought you back from that sabbatical? And obviously there was a lot that you were changed by in reading the autobiography, but what else happened and what led you to work with complex trauma?
I had those 8 ACEs on the one hand, but I also had resources on the other hand, which allowed me to be in an extensive self-directed inquiry for over 10 years. And that was deep. There were so many contexts where I was facing things that were very different than the social construct that I grew up in. And there was a lot of cognitive dissonance as I entered some of those spaces. But I also knew that a lot of what I'd been exposed to and a lot of conventional wisdom was worth questioning. And so as I exposed myself and this exploration went on in ways that were very empowering and nourishing and healing, if not also very challenging, there were moments that I felt like I was going through a desert, But the dynamics of seeing transformation, witnessing that is a real phenomenon that exists, that's as real as anything can be, just experiencing my own healing process, I felt very compelled to share that with others. And so that's where some of my individual and group work comes in. But I'm also just fascinated by societal progress and the way that systems work and the way that culture works and the way that the individual and collective are in relationship with each other, the way that the inner and outer are in relationship with each other, the way that the invisible and visible are in relationship with each other. And I'm just super curious. And so I just want to express in different ways. I want to investigate in different ways. And so all of that, it just felt natural to start bringing much more into a standard professional context again and then face the cognitive dissonance coming back that way as well. And I feel like I'm still in a very early stage of that cycle, to be honest, but a lot has opened in a short period of time. And I'm enjoying the unfolding of this inquiry now.
Yeah, what landed for me was really just your curiosity that you named. What was really guiding you in the process was just that you're curious about systems and how individuals relate to systems and systems relate to the individual and individuals relate to each other. And that sounds like you were just really guided by your curiosity, which my next question is, how did you come to the NARM work? And I'm just going to guess it was your curiosity, but I'm sure there's more to that.
Yeah. Well, when I asked this friend in the midst of these relational difficulties, what she suggested, how I might work directly, what are some modalities that she appreciates, she mentioned NARM. And one of the things she said more than once is that it's subtle but powerful. And I was intrigued by that. And when I read Healing Developmental Trauma, because I'd had these explorations into all these global wisdom traditions and different elements, and I was amazed to find how coherent the framework is. There's so many different elements to it, but it all hangs together. And it's deep. It's really deep and it's powerful, and that it's as fine of a method as I could conceive of. Like, it just blew me away for one-on-one work. I'm a really big fan. One of the things that I did also in my life is I've partly in the achiever path moments, but then again revisiting later in life, was I've earned 3 advanced degrees, in law, business, and economics. And I didn't see myself ever going back to school, but it feels worthwhile to begin the study of a 4th just to meet the qualifications and the prerequisites to go on to level 2 of NARM. And I'm that drawn to it. I really find it fascinating, and I find it super beautiful. And, even the few elements that I've integrated from basics training with my clients for sure are accelerating their processes. I really appreciate what I notice it supporting in my individual clients. I'll say one other thing actually, which is I like to experiment, and I'm here in South Africa. I connected to somebody and I started offering a course for a group here, and the group was super receptive, and I'm really grateful for their warm response. What I can say is that yesterday I introduced them to the survival styles. And I remember my own experience of being introduced to the survival styles during basics. And I remember a lot of the people around me. And it's amazing because I'm typically looking for experiential approaches to put people in touch with their deeper content and ways that they can access that in a way that supports integration. What's amazing is that just the theory of survival styles is so powerful and creates new openings, and sometimes a kind of depth and introspection that can be a little bit heavy as well. But that challenge is always well taken on, is how it's played out in my experience. And I find that I've not seen that anywhere, that just the theory puts people in touch with some of their own content. I find it amazing.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And that was my experience too, going through the training. What you talked about, how it brings up this introspection. And what I really appreciated, and I'd love to hear your experience, but I really appreciated the environment that was created in, as Brad shared the theory and the survival styles, it felt like such a safe environment to actually look at myself and take a look at the ways I had survived, because I had been in spaces where things had been brought up to me. A mirror had been held up, but I wasn't ready partly because of the environment. Didn't feel like a space that I could do that. And that was one thing that I really appreciated about the experience of OBT and the level 2, is that the environment that was created, the container that's created, feels like a safe place to do that kind of deep introspection, even just hearing the theory. But I'm curious to hear your experience with that.
Yeah, that certainly resonates with me, Emily, what you're describing. And I can say, I feel that space to be a very warm space, and I feel it to be a very humanistic space. And I feel, Brad and Stephanie, for example, to be excellent role models within this work in how they express themselves and the sort of energetic feel you get from them, just who they are as people. And it is a very supportive space. I've experienced it in that way as well.
That's nice to hear. I'm curious, because you've talked about your group work and even just this last experience that you had of introducing the survival styles. I'm curious if there's what else you have been able to integrate from your NARM. And it's pretty fresh, right? I mean, I don't even know when you went through the training, but it's amazing that you're already integrating that work. But I'm curious if there's anything specific you'd like to speak to.
Yeah, I just did basics in April through June, and then I've been doing the inner circle work since then. I teach workshops on self-awareness in the UN system, and those have been well received, fortunately. And I'd say that even if I'm not directly bringing in NARM into those spaces, it's directed at the exact same fundamental organizing self, like that there's something beyond the content of our minds, the content of what we take to be our full identity, and creating spaces for people to be in an exploration. And in that space, for example, they're not specifically seeking me out. They're choosing a professional development program that their organization chooses. So I want to be respectful of the context in which I'm operating, but I also want to offer what I have to offer. And a lot of times it's introductory work for people. And so I'll start with elements like neuroscience, which sort of establish a certain framework and grounding. And I'll just scaffold and scaffold and scaffold. And by the end of a 2-hour session, we're doing a meditation on the collective trauma that people experienced, you know? And so NARM is always informing me in some way. And it's like, even when I'm doing teamwork, the principles are around, and I really appreciate it. And I hold it alongside so many other modalities that I've explored for sure. But I love how, in a professional context with individuals especially, but I think also the principles are conducive, they're susceptible to being extrapolated to different levels of scale, you know, like teams and organizations and systems as well. So I feel very informed. I feel like it's always there, even when it's indirect.
Yeah. And it sounds to me like it helps you create that container of safety that I was talking about. Like, I imagine in group work, that's a pretty important piece, just as you carry yourself and as you interact with individuals.
Yeah. And I can say for sure as well, that shift from, you know, some of the elements of my own self as like in a helping profession, so to speak. I mean, sometimes I'm operating as a consultant, which isn't quite how we intend it when we're talking about that in NARM. But some of that piece around unmanaged empathy, for example, checking that in myself, checking, you know, going deeper and defining where some of my motivations are and starting to do the work to transform that element within myself, alchemize that element within myself. And the piece around stepping out of like an expert-based model into an inquiry-driven model, a curiosity-driven model. Those are pieces that I had explored in the past in different ways, but they started landing more. They continued that trajectory, that progression as I started investigating NARM.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The unmanaged empathy has continued to be a place that I'm exploring as well. So yeah, I appreciate you naming that. Would you share with us any stories of struggle or inspiration, you know, in working with teams?
I can maybe illustrate that point that I've been bringing up around how it's almost like the way I think about it is almost like it's like Russian nesting dolls, you know, it's at the biggest level is like global society. And then you have national societies and then whatever state level and down to the individual. And it's impossible for us as individuals not to hold in our own body. If you study field theory at all, it's impossible for us as individuals to not absorb elements of what's going on in those broader contexts. As you know, the kind of cultural trauma, there's a slide that Brad shows about the 3 realms of ACEs, and it gives you a sense of how culture is embedded within environment and communities embedded within that, and then families embedded within that, how they're all kind of nested in each other. And so teams are interesting because, or organizations or bigger systems are interesting because you have a kind of the meeting point of both sides, like the societal level and the individual level meets in an organization to a certain extent. And so how to help an organization feel into itself isn't how a lot of organizations are even oriented in their own developmental work. But if you take a situation like a team that I was recently working with, or I mean, I could bring a number of examples, but one is you have a team that it's 5 of the 6 members are Western and white. I think 4 of them were American. 1 was Asian, and they've been together for over 10 years. And I'll just stop there, but they were having a challenge about diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And they're all in the demographic of either close to or existing in the baby boomer generation. And so that's something that exists on the societal level, right? Is like, we're all looking actually, especially in the aftermath of George Floyd and everything that happened with the Black Lives Matter movement, we're all looking at racial issues. This is a hot issue in organizational life. and in societal life. And a lot of us are doing that work inside ourselves as well. So we had a really challenging situation because me and my co-facilitator did, because in the first two sessions, they were deeply in denial about the fact that complaints had been raised, complaints about bullying behavior. And they're really amazing professionals on a lot of levels, but just have this blind spot, just have this big blind spot. And so they had shut down areas that we thought to activate a kind of self-awareness through a survey or through stakeholders coming in and speaking with them about their experience with the team. And we were kind of at a loss. It's like, if they're shutting down these means of kind of bringing in some reflections, what do we do?
And by shutting down, you mean they were saying, no, we're not going to do that? Or what does shutting down mean?
We're not open to doing that. Yeah. And so we ended up using an approach that enabled them to, and I'm not sure how specific to be here, but that enabled them to generate some of that awareness internally as a team. And so there was kind of a corner that was turned. But the challenge was that they still didn't completely buy in to some of the shifts that we were attempting to explore with them, inquire about, advocate for to a certain degree. And so if they go ahead and facilitate a conversation with their division and the complainant is in that meeting and they're talking about how disappointed they are that this complaint happened and that they're disappointed and they're not actually creating space for it, that's the same dynamic in the individual where you're repressing emotion. That energy gets stuck in the system, And so the system ends up being exactly what we see in ourselves when we repress our own emotion, and that's like a top-down dynamic. And so you see how that plays out fractally in that same context, is the voice being suppressed. And that happens all the time, right? Like, there's so many ways in our systems that top gets disconnected from bottom. And the view is very different in those places. And unless you're activating means by which the communication is really flowing the same way that in NARM, we're working to be top down and bottom up in the individual, such that that energy can reintegrate and the regulation starts happening in the nervous system. The psychobiological capacity here is analogous to the capacity for collaboration, execution, innovation. If that's not happening in the organizational space, you're missing a big part of the picture. And so that's a kind of deeper way that I believe we need to be thinking about organizational life, systemic life.
Yeah, you've named something really important, that like systems are alive and that there's those kinds of experiences that you're talking about. And when we work with systems or families or relationship, it's got to be a top-down, bottom-up experience, because just this repression that you're talking about, I can see it as you're talking about. It's like, I can see it in so many different ways in different organizations in society. And you're naming something so important, that as we approach working with those systems, that it's got to be a top-down, bottom-up. It's got to be both.
And there's so many ways in which there's a lot of really bright thinkers doing incredible work and advancing the conversation in all sorts of contexts, not least of which is organizational context. And I think we still also need to be able to call a spade, point out where dysfunction exists, where things can improve. There's a slide that I present, and I've presented it a number of times, and it's just called Painful Challenges of Current Organizational Life. And it has things on there like secrecy and siloed mentalities and dreading Monday and anticipating Friday, and breakdowns in communication and all sorts of things, different colors, and it's just kind of spread across the slide. And I asked people about their experience of that. And I'm always getting nodded heads in those moments where I show that slide. And one woman, it's almost funny if it wasn't also a little bit sad. She was just like, well, we're not an enlightened organization. We have all of those symptoms,
Oh.
And they're good people bringing the best of themselves into their work, but it's just challenging, and so we're all in it together, right? Trying to do this work, trying to make sense of it, trying to explore, because ultimately, the way I look at it on another level, on the whole societal level, is like, look, the last few centuries have brought some incredible advancements in a lot of different ways. And we explored different aspects of life that were incredible in a lot of regards, but it's also been at a huge cost. And that we're really, really at this point very out of balance with planet Earth and with each other and with ourselves. That's what a lot of leaders speak about, these three kind of main divides and these three areas of connection and well-being. And so just to notice that means, okay, what got us here? Okay, let's bow to that. And then let's also acknowledge its shortcomings. And let's move on from here. And let's say, what got us here is not going to get us where we need to go. And let's start questioning the conventional wisdom upon which all of that is founded. And a lot of people are. It's beautiful to see a lot of people asking much bigger questions, like existential questions in the mainstream in a way that you've never seen before. It's really powerful. It's profound what's happening in this moment of massive disruption.
Yeah. I wondered if we could rewind just a little bit. My brain is still like having this question. When you were talking about working with that team and you said that they were kind of resisting, all of these ways that you could have potentially helped them come to some self-reflection. I'm curious what it was that helped turn a corner.
So the strongest moment of that engagement for me personally as a practitioner was before the third session, after we'd had two sessions, and that phenomenon of denial, right? We see that play out on a team level in the same way that it can play out in an individual as a survival strategy, as a defense mechanism. That was playing out at the team level. And I was like, okay, well, challenging them in the way that we have been challenging them hasn't been working. What happens if we really just try to meet them where they're at and we try to be empathetic to the challenge they're facing right now? And I was like, how do we do that? And I was just strategizing, and I was like pacing in my room and trying to, think through it and figure it out and feel into my heart as well. And we came up with a strategy. There's several methodologies that I really appreciate out there and that I work with. One of them is called liberating structures. And there's a number of means of getting involved with participatory change, including voices. And we did one called Heard, Seen, Respected, which actually people speak with each other about moments where they were felt unheard, unseen, or disrespected. And so because they were feeling that so strongly in this moment, it just settled something in the kind of collective nervous system, so to speak, quote unquote. And then they could also make the leap to notice, hey, look how common this actually is as a human phenomenon. Maybe it's not surprising that people in our division feel this way. And then we went into this other exercise, which the first question of that exercise is, what is a realistic, like non-extreme, worst case scenario of you operating in a way that doesn't include all voices? And so then they generate ways that they may end up operating, ways of being on a team level that wouldn't be what they want, but this is a worst case scenario. And then the second question is, what are all the things you could be doing that move you in the direction of that worst case scenario? And so they generate like a bunch of ideas about different types of practices, organizational practices, team practices. And then the third question is, what are you already doing that in some way, shape, or form resembles those behaviors you identified in the second question? And that's kind of the light bulb moment where self-awareness really grows. And you're supporting the team to be kind of in contact with its collective self and say, oh, wow, noticing, okay, there's a lot that we're doing here that actually leads us towards consequences that none of us want. That was kind of the turning point in the scenario of that engagement.
I'm so appreciating everything that you're sharing here. The first thing that landed for me was that your process of understanding them and meet them where they're at and being empathetic to the challenges. And so you had to get connected with yourself. That's what I heard you say. I was pacing in my room and feeling out your heart, and that there had to be that connection to self, right? As you approach and meet this group where they're at. So that was the first thing that really landed for me, was that connection, the 50-50, right? That we talk about in NARM. And then this piece of like humanizing, going through this inquiry of like humanizing, like, what's the worst case scenario that's not extreme, but could happen, that you could see happening, and not like vilifying it, but bringing the humanity to it. Like, hey, let's just explore this. And even just as you were talking about it, I thought, oh, wow, that would be a safe place to explore when you explored it that way, when you're meeting them where they're at, when you're just saying, hey, what could happen? What could potentially happen? Let's get curious, and have it, bringing that curiosity to it, and then asking these other questions. That's just so beautiful. I really appreciate you sharing how you kind of thread in and integrate this work with groups, because I imagine there's a lot of us listening that are curious how you can thread this in and working with groups and bringing that humanity and the 50-50 and that kind of inquiry is really beautiful. And then that last piece that you shared of where it lands, the kerplunk, right? That we hear Brad talk about, of the light bulb moment where we're understanding, connecting to ourselves. And it sounds like they had a connection with themselves in that moment. They were able to connect to themselves and realize, oh, this is what's happening. Okay, how can we move forward in a different way?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for those reflections. I appreciate hearing how it landed with you.
Yeah, so helpful. I want to talk more about your work and more of what you're doing, but I also want to hear, about your own process. You shared at the beginning, kind of where you started your journey before your 10 years of kind of self-reflection and going through your process. But I'm curious to hear more about your process in working with your own complex trauma and how that helped you get to a place where you're able to support others.
One of the things my brother also brings up, having grown up in the same household, I'm the youngest of 5, actually. Mm-hmm. He's always asking what moves the needle in terms of developmental stuff. And, I think that I've needed a ton of support, to be honest. And I've had the incredible pleasure of working with really a lot of world-class teachers. And I've worked with it in a variety of formats, extended retreats and one-on-one work and group work, and pretty much just a lot of different modalities. And like I said earlier, and like you picked up, I've been really curious. And I'd say, there are 4 or 5 key things that I come back to, which would be trauma and shadow work in the realm of depth psychology, and how human nature actually functions. Plant medicine, which I've worked with extensively and I know is a growing theme in the world these days, and a few different forms of body work, but not least of which was Aileen's form of body work, but also one called network spinal analysis, which works directly with the nervous system in a beautiful way. Vipassana meditation. I've done a number of Vipassana meditation retreats alongside other silent meditation retreats. And then just working with different wisdom traditions and their embodied practices and their elements of their philosophies. And if within the mainstream we have this set of conventional wisdom that isn't serving us so well any longer, then it behooves us to look beyond that to other traditions that maybe were grounds for healthier societies and more integrated societies, and see what they did as a reference point, and be humble in our inquiry about which elements may be things that we would want to bring back into where we're at today. What is relevant to what we're facing today? Mm-hmm. So those are some of the main things that have supported me in my process, and then also really inform my view on both an organizational level, but also a societal level. And one element of my work that I haven't spoken to yet is that I'm getting increasing opportunities for speaking engagements. And some of these themes are some of the threads which I bring in because people are asking bigger questions. And I've had some amazing opportunities to reflect on those from a lot of different angles. And I'm happy to share what I know if people are curious to hear from me.
That was one thing that jumped out at me, to go back to what you were saying, the traditional wisdom, that you've turned to that. And you're really looking at, what is lost in the conventional way that we're approaching life nowadays there's so much that we've lost in society that is still very alive in many cultures. And what can we learn from that, and approaching that with humility? That really jumped out at me as I was scrolling your webpage and just learning more about the work that you're doing. I really appreciate that and appreciate you naming that. I don't want to end yet because I feel like there's so much, but how about I just ask, is there anything else that you feel like would benefit our listeners in their own exploration?
Yeah. There's so much that I would want to offer in the way of encouragement, and it comes across a lot in my work, and I do create whole courses around some of this stuff. But one of the things that I really appreciate about NARM as well is just its understanding of having a role to play in the broader trauma-informed movement. And I'd say that once you get to understand trauma at all, it is nourishing of compassion in oneself, I find. When you see that trauma is actually based in the intelligence of life and the brilliance of life's ability to meet, any number, like an infinite number of contexts, and that the challenges we face in society are ways in which we're not trauma informed. It's really, those of us who are, the audience, and myself included, who's listening to this podcast, that are engaged with this movement in various forms. I want to say thank you. Thank you for doing the work that you do. Thank you for sharing your form of being trauma informed in the world, and for taking it into any number of contexts out there. And my economics dissertation, I think it's kind of funny, but I think it's also realistic that it was actually based on a Rumi poem. And I would like to recite that poem because I think it's directly connected to the trauma-informed movement. And I'm going to see, I started doing it from memory recently, and let's see if I manage to do that now. This world river has no water in it. Come back, spring. Bring water that pulses in the fountain of the soul. Where water is, there bread arrives, but never the reverse. Water never comes from loaves. You are the honored guest. Do not weep like a beggar for pieces of the world. When the water flows towards you, you will feel a deep contentment. The night watchman shakes his rattle as part of his fear. You will not need him anymore. Water itself guards the fish that are in it.
Wow. I would love to read your dissertation now, having heard that. Share with us what brought you to basing your work on that poem, which I have, some ideas, but.
Yeah, well, I've read solid chunks of Brad's dissertation, and I feel like we have a lot of overlap in questioning some of where we're at in Western civilization. I took an economics angle because that was the course of study in which I was engaged, but I was making a broader point. And, scarcity is at the center of the definition of economics. That's on page 1 of economics textbooks. And I see scarcity as a symptom, like the experience of scarcity, like the feeling in our bodies of scarcity, the perception that's formed by scarcity. There's a lot out there on scarcity mindset, but also the perception of scarcity. It emerges from trauma. And when you put it on a societal level, at the center of the discipline which most drives society, it's an expression of the trauma, and it perpetuates the trauma. And so there's this kind of vicious cycle around scarcity and trauma, and that we take for granted that scarcity is reality. Like economics takes that for granted, but it's a social construct, actually, I would argue, and is at least worth inquiring into. And there are plenty of societies that were not based on scarcity that were much healthier. And so we stand to learn from those societies, and we stand to see how this idea that is so prevalent in the mainstream of finding happiness outside ourselves, finding happiness in our material lives. It's like I sometimes like to say, you can't practice trumpet and become a violin player. Our happiness is an inner phenomenon. Fulfillment is an inner phenomenon. And so this idea of trying to find it outside is because we're trying to put bread before water, and that's based on a system that's at its very foundation is based in scarcity. And there are areas, of course, where grave material want exists. But we need to look to the history of those places and the colonization that factors into those places and look that that's more an issue of maldistribution than an issue of actual scarcity existing. So those are some of the elements on an economic level, but also how it ties in between the individual and the collective and how it plays out between the visible and the invisible and some of those elements. And there's like a cultural investigation about some of the ideas that exist in the collective unconsciousness around scarcity as well. Some of the elements of our relationship to soul, some of the elements of scientific materialism, some of the elements of, just different ways that we conceive the world that are outdated, that are unchecked assumptions at this point that we would do well to investigate going forward.
Wow, I'm really appreciating just the background that you bring, to this interview is really special because, and this is what I love about the OBT training, is the variety of, backgrounds of everyone in that training. It's so rich. And I learned so much in those trainings because of everyone bringing what they're coming from and the material that they're working with. It's me in my privileged space here. But I'm really appreciating these points that you're bringing up. I had never heard the term maldistribution. That's probably a term that lots of people are familiar with. I know we're coming up on our time and I want to respect your time, but was there something else you wanted to say around that?
I remember, I'll just share another personal story. I remember walking down the hall of my elementary school when I was 6 years old and saying to myself, if I can't get the love that I'm looking for at home, I'm going to get it at school, and that was already an escape from my heart in that moment into my mind, because I already wasn't enough. There was already scarcity present as an expression of my disconnection, as an expression of my complex trauma. And so I guess, my reflection alongside the audience is just to acknowledge, in the systems that we're in right now, how easy it is for this stuff to exist, and it, to varying degrees in all of us, or at least most of us, perhaps, and encourage our gentleness with ourselves, an acknowledgement of our humanness, and a willingness to carry forward. I think that discipline and patience and, some of these elements have been absolutely essential as my work has carried forward on an inner level. And I feel, one other point I'd make is that I like Pema Chodron's quote. She said at one point, we transform ourselves in order to help other people, and we help other people in order to transform ourselves. And that ongoing cycle of society getting healthier and healthier, and the ways that we can all contribute. And I don't know, I think we're going to see a lot of crazy stuff in the next decade, to be honest. And ultimately, I'm still optimistic because I believe in the human spirit.
Mm-hmm. I love it. Well, as we come on our time, I'm so curious to have you share with our listeners where we can find you.
Yeah, sure. I actually have two websites. One is pgoel.com, like my first initial and last name. And my other is imaginally.com, IMAGINALLY. You can find me at either of those places, and I'd be happy to receive any inquiries.
Great. And we'll put those in the show notes too, so that folks can find them pretty easy. So Well, thank you so much, Prashant. This has been a lovely hour spending with you and getting to know you better. And I appreciate the work that you're doing with the NARM community. So thank you.
Thank you, Emily. And I really appreciate you as a host, and I've enjoyed this conversation. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Are you interested in deepening your understanding of NARM? We are thrilled to offer the Inner Circle, NARM's online learning community. Each month, members receive direct mentorship from NARM creator Dr. Lawrence Heller, NARM training director Brad Kammer, and other NARM faculty through live webinars. The Inner Circle is also a hub for the international NARM community, where people working with complex trauma from around the world come together to connect, network, and develop trauma-informed projects to benefit our world. Visit narmtraining.com/innercircle to sign up and for more information. Our Transforming Trauma listeners can receive $100 off your annual membership when using the code TransformingTrauma15 at checkout. Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma.